Llorona by Hair-Raising-Narratives. I could hear it crying again. It was a haunting sound, a melancholy wail that barely sounded human, but I knew it was a woman's cry. I'd heard it before. It was a sound that crept into my dreams and stayed there until I woke at sunrise with it still ringing in my ears. It was a sound I couldn't seem to shake. Even in the silence of the night, when the whole world seemed empty, I could still hear her crying. I didn't know who it was crying every night. Every time I heard it, I felt a strange reluctance to get up and see. Maybe I didn't want to know the truth. Maybe I was too scared. I don't know how long I kept on going like this. My sleep interrupted at least 4 nights a week because of the noise of a woman's sobs outside my window. But everything changed the night that I saw her. The night that I finally had enough courage to climb out of bed and investigate this mysterious crier. I remember the night well. It had been raining the day before, and the river that ran along outside of our property was flooded. Before I heard the woman, I could hear the water rushing up against the bank with an unnaturally fast current. The sound of the water eventually lulled me to sleep, and I fell into a dream about a stranger who cried on the riverbank at night. When I woke up, it was still dark, and my dream had become reality. Her sobs sounded louder than usual, more desperate. It almost seemed as though she was standing right outside my window, and I was afraid to look, in case I saw a face peering through. I tried to pull the covers over my ears and ignore, like I usually did, but it followed me even then, a sound that came from everywhere at once. Eventually, I grew impatient and strangely curious. I wanted to know who had been crying outside this whole time. I wanted to see who it was, rather than hiding away in the dark and trying to ignore it. I wanted to see who it was, rather than hiding away in the dark and trying to ignore it. What if, all this time, they had needed help, had cried out for someone, and I had heard but not listened? I had never brought it up to my family before, but they've never mentioned it either, so I had assumed their nights were uninterrupted and silent. Bracing myself against the chill of the room, I swung my legs over the edge of the bed and dropped to the floor. Shivering, I reached for a sweater, pulling it on, and tiptoed over to the window. The curtains were only partially drawn, and a sliver of moonlight crept in through the gap, lighting the windowsill. I kept to the shadows, not wanting to be seen from anyone standing outside. I peered around to look through the glass. At first I saw nothing, just the sparse trees in the distance, and the river that bubbled along outside, lapping the very edge of the bank. Then I noticed the first figure, standing a short distance away, staring down into the water. Even in the dark, facing away from me, I could tell it was a woman. Her white dress shone in the moonlight, and long dark hair tumbled down her neck. This was who I heard crying all those lonely nights. But why was she out here? Where had she come from? I stayed frozen in place, my breath fogging up the window as I watched her shoulders tremble with each sob. Part of me was compelled to go out there and make sure she was okay, but the other half of me was content staying right where I was, protected from the chill of the night. As I watched, the woman seemed to freeze in place. I saw her shoulders fall still, and she lifted her head slightly, her hair fluttering in the window. Then she turned and looked at me. The movement was so sudden and unexpected, it startled me, and I stumbled back over my feet, landing on the floor below the window with a dull thud. Had she seen me? Had she known I was watching her? I didn't manage to see her face, but I knew she looked right at me, right at the window where I'd been peering out. I stayed on the floor, pulling my legs up to my chest and forcing myself to stay still and quiet. If my parents heard, they'd scold me for not being in bed. But I was too scared to get up, in case the woman was still looking for me. Every hair on my arm suddenly stood on end, and the air around me grew colder, like a drought was creeping inside. I froze. Someone was tapping on the window. Fingers scraped against the glass, scratching to get in. Was it her? Was it the woman? I hardly dared to look. A shiver crept along my neck, and my breathing was shaky and stiff. Could she see me right now? Did she know I was here hiding? My neck was starting to cramp, but I was too scared to move or even lift my head. What did she want from me? After what felt like half an hour had passed, the chill receded, and the night went silent, and I finally mustered enough courage to take a look. I crawled out from beneath the window and glanced up. The woman was gone. Relief flooded my body, and I hastily drew the curtains the rest of the way, scampering back to bed. I pulled the covers up to my ears and squeezed my eyes closed, and eventually fell into a deep but troubled sleep. The following night, I was too scared to fall asleep. I couldn't think about the woman outside or what had happened last night. She'd seen me and tapped at my window. But why? What had she wanted? And why was she always crying? Had something bad happened? I had so many questions about the woman in the white dress, but I was too scared to broach the topic with my parents. So I went to bed without a word, shutting the door quietly behind me before tiptoeing over to the window. It was still early in the night, not much later than 9, and the waterfront outside of our house was empty. The woman clearly didn't come out until later. With that, I shut my curtains fully and went to bed. I laid awake for some time, staring up at the ceiling, almost anticipating the crying to start, but it never came. I kept flickering a glance over to the window, making sure the curtains were closed completely, sometimes expecting there to be a silhouette of a woman standing there, but there never was. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep, because a short while later, I bolted awake to the sound of a scream. It was a horrible, gut-wrenching noise that dug straight into my dreams and yanked me out of them. I have a start, breathing heavily as I stared around my room. Had I imagined it? Or had I really heard someone scream? It was a woman's cry, no doubt, and my thoughts went immediately to the stranger outside. I couldn't hear anything at the moment, but held my breath all the same, listening to the smallest sound. The gentle rush of water, a lone bird call, and the faint sound of a woman's voice, whispering in the silence in between. That's when I realized that she was calling my name. I let out a shaky breath, unable to hold it any longer. Was I imagining things? Or was she really saying my name? But how could she have known, unless she knew me? Unless she saw me that night and knew who I was? I glanced at the window again, thinking I saw movement. There was still nobody there, but I felt like she was close, like she was looking at me, like she was looking for me. A shiver ran along my arms, bringing out goosebumps, and I clutched the covers tighter between my fists. What was I supposed to do? I couldn't just ignore her, now that she was calling my name. But what happened if I went out to her? What did she want from me? I was on my feet before I realized what I was doing, my toes curling against the cold floorboards, careful not to make a noise. I padded over to the window and parted the curtain ever so slightly. The woman was standing by the water, staring right at me. This time, I didn't shy away. She was a beautiful woman, with the delicate features and a kind smile. I saw her lips move, and I heard my name on the wind. And somehow I felt at ease, calm. She wasn't crying anymore. In her white gown, her dark hair spilling over her shoulders, she looked almost like an angel. When she lifted a slender hand and beckoned me towards her, I felt compelled. She was calling for me, and I felt like I had no choice but to answer. Pulling the curtains aside, I began fumbling with the latch on the window, throwing it open as far as I could. The gap wasn't huge, but my slender body would fit through easily. A chill wind gusted into the room, but I barely noticed. Scrambling up onto my knees and half tumbling through the window onto the ground outside, I pulled myself back onto my feet and looked up. And the woman was no longer facing me, but staring down into the water by her feet. The wind stirred her hair, giving me glimpses of her pale skin. I felt like I should say something to her. But I didn't know what. So instead, I went closer, my feet growing numb in the cold. She murmured something, but her voice was too quiet for me to hear. I wondered what she was looking at in the water. I had only ever seen her walking by the river, crying and wailing like a mother who had lost her child. As I approached, the wind picked up, and a nauseating smell assaulted my senses. It reminded me of the time my friend had showed me the carcass of a chicken that had been left out in the sun, maggots crawling through the rotting flesh. It was only a short distance from the woman when I realized something was dreadfully wrong. It was her reflection that I saw, distorted by the running water. It wasn't completely clear, but I could see it wasn't the same woman I had seen earlier, with the delicate features. This woman's face was old, haggard, with hollow black eyes and a gruesome smile. Before I could make my body move, the woman turned around and reached for me with sharp, serrated nails. This woman barely looked human. Her face was sunken and ragged, and her hair thin and falling out in clumps. Her dress was torn and stained with something dark, and her skin had an odd grayish tinge to it. Realizing I had been tricked, I tried to jump out of her reach, but I felt her nails claws into the flesh of my arm, making me lose my balance. I went backward, straight towards the water, but managed to catch myself on the bank, digging my hands into the dirt to stop myself from falling in. That's when I felt hands reaching out from the water, trying to grab my legs. The woman was in the water, her mouth screaming slightly as she tried to pull me in after her. I kicked and thrashed, and then something grabbed me from behind, hauling me back. Someone called my name, grabbing my arms to stop me from thrashing, and I finally paused long enough to realize the woman was gone. The person who had hold of me was my father. "Papa!" I gasped, looking up into his dark, cloudy eyes. Ignoring the anger on his face, I jumped into his arms, sobbing. "She tried to get me. She tried to pull me in." My father took me back into the house, where my mother and grandmother were both waiting anxiously in the kitchen. They must have heard me leave, or they had figured something was wrong. My mother pulled me into her arms, and I realized I was trembling from the cold. "What were you doing out there?" she cried, cradling my head. You could have fallen into the water." "The woman, she tricked me," I told her, but my parents both looked at me like I was telling them a story. "What woman? There was nobody out there," my mother assured me. "You were sleepwalking, son." my father said. What you saw wasn't real. I shook my head adamantly. I wasn't, Papa. The woman was crying. I heard her every night, but then she said my name. She tricked me into going out there. Don't speak such nonsense, my father admonished. There was no woman out there. You've wasted enough time tonight. It's time to go back to bed. I'll make sure your window is locked this time. My father went ahead of me up to my room and let my shoulders sag in defeat. They clearly weren't going to believe me. My mother walked off muttering something about needing a drink, leaving me alone with my grandmother. That's when I noticed that she was staring at me, a strange look into her eyes. You heard her, didn't you, child? She said, her old face crinkling. La Llorona, the woman who weeps for her children. I blinked at her at a loss. She believed me. She knew who the woman was. She beckoned me closer, and I obediently stepped over to her, straining to hear her quiet whispers. If you hear a woman crying at night, she said, do not listen, or she will trick you into following her into the afterlife. With those words of warning, she hobbled stiffly away, leaving me shivering alone in the room.